I remember being about 7 or 8 years old, and I was a wee bit of a smart aleck. Imagine that. But I remember going to a baseball game, and there was a guy in the stands. He was a coach of another team, not a coach of our team. And he had seen some mistakes that I'd made on the field. And he said to me, "Let me tell you a little story." And he probably wasn't 4 or 5 words into the story when I said, "Oh, I think I've heard this one. Oh, I think I've heard this one. Yeah, I've heard this one. I know I've heard this one. It doesn't really matter to me. I've already heard this one. I already know all the answers." Now, I don't know about you, but at 7 years old, when someone else is telling you a story, the odds that you've already heard it, that you already know all the answers is, well, frankly, it's pretty slim. But there's still something unique about a story when it comes to communicating ideas and thoughts and genuine transformation to another person. Something about the story that gives it power to bring that transformation. Welcome to Leading Leaders Podcast. 5-minute videos, 5 days a week. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. And if you've watched this Leading Leaders Podcast for any period of time, you know that story is a really big deal to me. I believe in storytelling. I believe that it's a craft that needs to be mastered. And I believe that as leaders, it is a tool that we should be using on a regular basis. Now, when I say story, there are some people who immediately think, well, I need to tell my life story, my journey, my everything that's happened to me, this soliloquy or soap opera of my whole life. That's the story that I need to tell. And generally speaking, I would say no. And here's why. Because no one really cares about your story. I'm sorry to say it. No one really cares about your story. Here's what they care about. People want to know if the story that you have to tell, the journey that you've been on, the things that you've overcome, the ideas that have reshaped your thinking process, if those ideas are going to be valuable to them. Even when you're storytelling around the campfire, around the Christmas tree, around the breakfast table, around dinner with friends, people are still asking one question. What's in it for me? Now, that's a hard thing to say about stories, especially when we feel like the cathartic aspect of telling our story, the way that we feel better when we tell our story, the way that we walk through the journey and kind of lay out the ideas. The reality is many people, they don't even think through the process of their story until they start telling it to somebody else. They haven't really thought about the pain of their journey, the revelations that they learned, the things that came about in their journey. It's when that story begins to come out of their mouth that they begin to think through, did it really happen like that? Did I really feel like that? What is the value of feeling that way? What have I learned along the way? What have I brought to other people? And that challenge to ask those tough questions really should be the part of writing your story that happens long before you tell it to anybody else. You should be sitting down with your journal and writing through and thinking through those elements, those aspects of your story. Now, sometimes those aspects are going to have an immediate commercial value. I did this, I learned this is what I came through. In fact, when I was in sales training at Verizon, one of the things that Chris Deershaw talked about all the time was the feel, felt, found method. Now, the feel, felt, found method of sales says basically, I know how you feel. I felt the same way when XYZ happened to me, and this is what I found as a solution to it. So the feel, felt, found method of selling really is oriented in storytelling. And if you have crafted that story to identify the product solution, to identify the actual help that it's going to provide, then there will be a transaction that follows that where people have buy-in not only to you and your product, but to the story as well. They see themselves in the solution because of the way you've told the story. Now, if you've watched this program for any length of time, you also know that I spend a lot of time in study. I spend a lot of time reading. I spend a lot of time watching videos. Some of those are about filmmaking. Some of those are about leadership. Some of those are about psychology. Some of those are about neuropsychology or neurosciences. And many of them kind of swirl together in my mind in the ways that we communicate with one another. And there are some powerful tools that are used in great cinema that are storytelling elements. Now, some are without words at all. In fact, I shared on my Facebook page yesterday a video, and without giving away the whole thing, you'll have to watch it because it'll still get you emotionally. You can watch this video with no sound and still get the entire storyline, and it will probably bring a wet tear to your eye just a little bit. But the gist of the story is that there's an old man who lives by himself, and he drags out an old kettlebell, just one, and he spends several days picking that kettlebell up over his head. And his neighbors are looking at him through the window thinking, what is this old man doing? He's lost his mind. And of course he struggles and he strains and he grunts because he's an old man. He hadn't done this in a while. And he drops it sometimes, and the neighbors are startled and they look through the window like, what is wrong with him? And his daughter even comes to check on him but doesn't say anything. She's just like, he's just determined. He's going to hurt himself, but he's not going to quit. And then the climax of the story comes when it's Christmas Day and he shows up at the house where the family is, and they open the box, and in the box is the little star to go on the top of the Christmas tree. And as they open the box, he hands the star to his granddaughter. She's probably 4 or 5. And then he bends down in the same way that he picked up the kettlebell, and he lifts the little girl to the top of the tree. And the look on his daughter's face when he lifts his granddaughter to the top of the tree is the climax of the story. That's when you realize she gets it. I know why he did what he did. It didn't make any sense along the journey, but it makes good sense now. Friends, when you're telling a story, especially as a leader, when you're hoping to influence the people in your organization and in your team, as they say in planes, trains, and automobiles, it's always better when you have a point, when you can get to the point, when you can make the point. But it's even better when the person who's receiving the point is the beneficiary that you're hoping to bring the most transformation to. It's real easy to get caught up in the idea of telling a story that's grandiose that makes you the champion. It's real easy to get caught up in a story where you feel like I've got to get the win. I've got to close the deal at the end of the day. But it's also really easy to overlook the fact that stories that resonate with people, those are the ones that bring the most transformation. In fact, one of the documentaries that I watched yesterday for my lunch hour documentary was about Pixar films and their early creation. And they talked about how they had what they called the dailies, where they would literally go through every animator who had written or drawn for the course of the day or the week a part of the movie. And each one was a sequence, a scene, just an element of it. It wasn't the whole movie. It wasn't the whole script. It wasn't beginning to end. It was like, you get this part and you get that part and you do this part. And one of the scenes that they were doing their dailies on, they were watching. And as they were watching it, the director paused it and he looked at the illustrator and he said, Can I just ask you a question? He said, why is Nemo not looking at his father? I mean, he looks like he's dead. He's not moving. His eyes are closed. When he does open his eyes, they're like off in the distant. They're not paying any attention to the father. And the artist said, thank you. I didn't see that. I was so much focused on the facial expressions and the gestures and the movement of Nemo's dad in that moment. I didn't even think about how Nemo would have reacted or responded. Now, I can tell you, if you ever ask the question, why is it that Finding Nemo is such a hit movie? Well, part of it was the animation. Part of it was the underwater scenery, the view of a world that most people have never seen in that way. It's spectacularly done through computer graphics and animation. But there was something else to that story, and the something else in that story was the undertone that was also the biggest part of the picture, and that was this. Stories resonate when people see themselves in them. When people realize that story, without being about me, is, well, it's really about me. When you realize that part of your life has been imitated in that story, that you can relate with it, that's called resonance. Now, if you're a storyteller, a leader, a communicator, a speechwriter, and you're telling stories that most people can't relate to because they're about some faraway place or some time or some experience that no one else gets, then you're going to have a hard time connecting with people. You're going to have a hard time resonating and a hard time, therefore, leading transformation. But if you really want to lead transformation, tell stories that people resonate with. See, the overarching story, the undertow of the wrapper around the outside of Finding Nemo is a reconciliation story. It's a coming of age story. It's not just a little boy who's lost, but a little boy who's lost and his dad never gives up looking for him. And when he finds him, he realizes that he doesn't have an incapable little boy. He has a young man for a son. And they're almost equals now. See, that part of the story, I think I saw, but I kind of didn't get as closely until I heard the artist himself say, part of my problem was I was skipping the character of Nemo because I was so focused on dad being a good dad. Now let me ask you the question, as a leader, how often do you tell stories? How often do you use those stories to resonate with the people that you want to lead or influence? How often do those stories resonate with the people that you're talking to because you're telling stories about life experiences that are very much like the life experiences they've had? If that's the way you're using stories, not to self-aggrandize, not to tell all about you because you're so wonderful and awesome, but to tell stories that have a moral point, that have a set of instructions embedded in them, that have a feel-felt-found method of moving somebody to a call to action, and that resonate with a life experience that they've walked through, now you've got a story that has the power to change somebody's life. And if you lead that way, you will lead well. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.